Joel Wendt here with the first set of videos on the content of the Coming Metamorphosis of Christianity. This one is called Sam Harris and Humanity's Moral Future and is related to his recent speech on the TED conference that's on the internet. I'll provide a URL for it. I'm a writer, not so much a public speaker, so I hope you won't mind too much if I read this to the camera instead of trying to render it seemingly spontaneously. I can do spontaneous, but not on this subject matter and in this context. Basically, I've written a response to Sam Harris's talk given at the recent TED conference. As I watched Sam Harris prowl the stage at the recent TED conference via the YouTube video, I was struck in part by how much he resembled a Protestant preacher. His system of beliefs was different, but it clearly meant the same thing to him that a preacher's religion means. For Sam Harris, this belief system included a kind of hyper-rationality, coupled with a faith in the teachings and the processes of natural science, which from his point of view saw itself as superior, as a truth process, to any worldview that might challenge it. The approach to moral issues that he proposed, however, and defended, bore little difference in style and felt passion to the views of someone whose Bible was the Old and New Testament, except that in Mr. Harris's case, the content of his Bible included evolution, Big Bang theory, and modern research on the brain. Lest the listener of this piece think that I'm just another lame-brained Christian fundamentalist, they should actually read my works, which are available for free on the internet. The difficulties with modern evolutionary theory are discussed in my essay, The Quiet Suffering of Nature. As regards the Big Bang theory, one can read about those problems in my essay, The Misconception of Cosmic Space, as appears in the Ideas of Modern Astronomy, and my examination of the limits of brain research, that is discussed in the essay, The Natural Christian. Just like a preacher, Mr. Harris was filled with a kind of self-righteous fervor, asserting that his was the right view, that his kind of science could ultimately answer all deep moral questions with what was right and true, and that the world should follow him, and that this would put an end to those religious views he despised. Now I do not exaggerate here, for despise was clearly what he felt, as he mocked and criticized religions and peoples for whom he had no real empathy, although his own view of himself he saw empathy as a human characteristic of high value. Asked at the end of his talk by a kind of moderator to reconsider his critical views of others and to reach for a more empathic understanding of what it might mean to be born and raised in a region of the world with a highly different culture and language, he refused. He was not interested at that point in a rationality counter to his own, and clearly spoke in an effort to convince not just his audience, but himself as well, through what he seemed to feel was rational argument, that the mocking and despising of large groups of people that he exhibited was itself morally defensible. Although he did not directly refer to it as one who follows his work, I am aware that he regularly includes, in those who should be mocked and found morally wanting, Christians and others who would be tolerant of different religious views. Mr. Harris has no tolerance for tolerance, which is a classic form of hypocrisy that, while allowing no acceptance of others, yet hypocritically finds its own similar in nature views entirely acceptable. It does not seem to enter into his consciousness that when Christ teaches in the Sermon on the Mount that we should be cautious about judging others and watch more closely the beam in our own eye and less closely the mote in another's eye, that right there in that teaching is the very core of a moral and ethical principle that is fully rational and scientific, The thing is that this principle needs to be actually practiced, a personal moral discipline with which Mr. Harris does not seem familiar. At the same time, we should be aware that Mr. Harris is not alone, and that many Christians do not themselves practice it, nor do many of those in other religions, including the religion of atheism. That Mr. Harris takes of the scientific enterprise and does exactly the same thing, that is, fail to see the beam in his own eye first, only continues and compounds the flawed human characteristic so many of us share, and that wants to judge, but not recognize in that impulse something profoundly weak and unloving. Mr. Harris wants us to believe that his religion of science will produce moral teachings that will rival what the great teacher of love offered to the world, while at the same time Mr. Harris is entirely unwilling to love those he mocks and despises. Trying to be rational, Mr. Harris proposes certain concepts as a basis for his prejudices. For example, he asserts that what one ought to do is to answer the deep historical questions of the problem of good and evil by holding as the highest value a kind of human rationality, similar to his, of course, and that the goal of any such limited rationality should express itself within our communities in an effort to promote what he calls the flourishing of the human being. He presents a fantasy of an idyllic future in which his style of rational morality will replace those values he mocks and despises, which fantasy is nothing new in the history of thought, but just another utopian dream that is bound to fail because it lacks a willingness to enter into a real understanding of what it means to be a human being. The great teacher of compassion, Gautama Buddha, proposed what he called the Four Noble Truths, which Mr. Harris has to know of as a modern educated man. But in Mr. Harris's universe, the first truth can't be seen, which Gautama Buddha put forward as life is suffering. I'm now going to pause because I have to divide this piece up more later.